There's an inherent intrigue associated with dystopian stories that tends to speak to us on a deep, fundamental level. While there has been a definite shift in the past couple of decades to the type of mass mindset that dystopias can tap into, a story that can use the human condition to show us the weaknesses of certain structures of order strikes a specific chord that draws people in regardless of external circumstance. For some, they're fascinating studies in psychology, where high stakes strip humanity down to its purest essence. For others, they're unique forms of escapism that reminds us that while the current world is bad, it's not as bad as it could be. Either way, these narratives are useful, because we know that humans are flawed and that there is likely no perfect ideology or societal structure. But knowing the flaws of certain systems that are laid bare in dystopia helps us to try and give it our best shot. One of the dystopia subgenre's biggest assets is its variability. Given that they are simply defined as imaginary places where people lead dehumanized and often fearful lives, these stories are essentially a blank slate for the writer's ideas to be laid out on. However, that does not mean that anything goes. The more fleshed out and well-constructed a setting is, the more believable it is, and internal believability is almost always essential for stories that intend to portray a warning, tell a message, and reflect a mirror on modern society. Given this variability, it comes as no surprise that two of the most notable dystopian anime of recent memory, Psycho-Pass and Shinsekai Yori, approach this style of story in such different ways. A cyberpunk future versus a primitive one, technology versus magic, and the semi-realistic versus the absolutely fantastical. Yet despite these differences, the two stories share some important parallels in what they're trying to say. This is partly because at a base level, dystopias are actually quite intimate. It all goes back to the fact that we desire to be free and live for me. We want our existence to be one that is for ourselves, not in service of anyone or anything else. We don't want to be shackled by oppression and fear, and striking a balance between living free and building a functioning society is a struggle that has gone on, and will continue to go on for generations because of the darkness lurking inside each person. And dystopias tackle this idea. But Psycho-Pass and Shinsekai Yori take this commonality a step further, and actually seem to agree with certain aspects of order, hierarchy, societal structure, and the way forward. However, before addressing that point, I think some value can be gained by looking at the stylistic contrasts between the two shows and the type of story that they're telling. In terms of displaying possible settings for a relatively near future, the two shows take approaches at opposite ends of the spectrum. On one hand, you have Psycho-Pass, a future Japan that gradually came into existence, revolving entirely around technological advancement to dictate the pattern of daily living. Life is built around the Sibyl system, an automated form of law enforcement that scans a person's psychological state and uses an algorithm to determine whether they are mentally stable enough to interact with society. If their mental state is unstable beyond a certain threshold, then they are officially labeled as latent criminals and taken in for rehabilitation or imprisonment, regardless of whether any crime was actually committed. The success rate of the rehabilitation is unknown to me, but that process is looked upon by those in the setting as a mere formality before being taken in as a true latent criminal. The world is dictated, oppressed, and totally controlled by the Sibyl system. However, despite some holes and moral problems that are obvious just from a brief description of the system, and despite the implications of whether such an existence is worthwhile for the everyday citizens, society in Psycho-Pass thrives on the whole, and criminal acts are quite rare before the events of the story. Shinsekai Yori, on the other hand, is essentially a pseudo-post-apocalypse whose setting is nearly polar opposite to Psycho-Pass's. In a primitive society with very little technology available, the citizens of this world are raised in a sheltered life, learning about and harnessing Cantus, which is this setting's form of magical power, as they grow up. Societal order revolves around controlling Cantus, since his power in the hands of deviant people is potentially devastating. Cantus is a very important and necessary tool for the people in Shinsekai Yori, but due to its volatility, it must be buffered, or else karma demons, people who unintentionally impose their Cantus destructively on the world around them, and fiends, intentionally destructive psychopaths, will emerge. And after many years of fine-tuning, the Ethics Committee and the Board of Education have come up with a system that monitors children growing up and flags any potential cases for karma demons or fiends. The types of personalities that tend to be precursors to fiends and karma demons are known, so children are monitored intensely. People are not given human rights until they turn 17, so the young can be disposed of if they are suspect or troublesome. Heterosexual romance is virtually outlawed at a young age, because the strong emotions it accentuates can lead to troublesome behavior. Vicious tainted cats are bred to hunt individuals that are marked as dangerous, memories of these dangerous people are wiped when they're gone, and through psychological conditioning, everyone is given death feedback, a mental mechanism which causes extreme physiological discomfort and even death if a person with Cantus tries to harm another human being, which makes it even more difficult to stop karma demons and fiends. Also, sentient humanoid rodents called queer rats live apart from humans, though they are oppressed by them and their role is to leave them alone or assist them if need be, their lives considered inferior. These rules and many more are enforced in order to maintain a peaceful society that can coexist with such powerful magic. But it's all a very stifling existence. The Board of Education and Ethics Committee have a hand in nearly every daily interaction, and society follows the book so tightly that lives are almost predestined. Whether they realize it or not, the people in Shinsekai Yori are controlled. Despite the clear aesthetic and technological differences, both settings share parallels with how they are run. A form of thought police is in order, people are constantly monitored, in most cases people are given specific roles in society regardless of choice, and the governments are generally feared rather than looked at as a system for peace due to their methods. Things are shaped so that any troublesome individuals or possible risks to a functional society are quickly snuffed out through systems that lean on probability rather than concrete truths. Both societies are bereft of individualism and liberty in order to maintain the health of the collective, and the tiny little risks that could snowball into bigger problems are scrutinized. In both cases, we have an incredibly Orwellian, oppressive government in place, and there is a telling message in that this sort of fascist regime is one that can organically weave its way into existence in any context. Shinsekai Yori's system was a result of acute reactionism, while Psychopath's system was one that naturally came to the forefront. But both systems are eerily similar in their style of subtle yet total control. And this says something about sociological order, its relation to human nature, and the potential within mankind for dominance and darkness. The contrast in style between the two anime is pretty apparent. Psychopaths is hard-hitting and high-impact, a story very much in the vein of a crime-action thriller with social commentary. It treads familiar dystopic ground through its premise and execution, but it sleekly presents its world and quickly adheres the audience to its characters using some very smart visual cues and exposition. Psychopaths tackles questions about the trajectory of humanity, free will, technology, and more, and it tackles these subjects while maintaining a dark tone and a notable fixation on its characters and their personal journeys. Not only this, but Psychopaths realizes a world that is very similar to our own. It's not hard to envision our nearish future cities mirroring Psychopaths' future Japan in terms of technology, or at least mirroring it with some notable alterations and ignoring the liberties that come with creating a fictional world. The art style is pretty realistic for anime, with less exaggerated proportions supplementing the harshness of the world and plot. The story hinges on a good number of big moments for its thesis. For example, Akane's dilemma in the first episode, Makishima's murder of her friend, Kogami vs. Makishima, the revelation of Sybil, and this all allows the viewer to reflect on those moments in tandem with the characters to let the messages sink in. In general, Psychopaths is direct, cinematic, and realistic with its storytelling, using a familiar premise in an effective way, and going the full 9 yards with its character focus and world building. Shinsekai Yori is a much slower burn. It is nearly as much of a brutal coming-of-age story as it is a social commentary, with Saki's journey being a primary focus. The style is much more ethereal and ponderous, with tension steadily rising as the episodes tick by, with an underlying tone of darkness. Where Psychopaths frontloads the problems with society and the darkness of the story almost immediately, Shinsekai Yori maintains an ominous tone and gradually reveals exactly what is wrong, peeling back the layers slowly as things like the oppression of the queer rats, the tainted cats, Squealer, Cantus, and fiends are subtly revealed and dwelled upon. It is a very fantastical story, with characters that, while relatable at some level, feel distinctly detached from our reality. The art style is simpler, but it experiments in many places, and this, along with the framing and directing, contributes to the abstract feel of the story. Aside from Saki and Squealer to a certain extent, Shinsekai Yori is not concerned much with character focus, and instead likes to be a bit of a tone piece, as we see what Saki sees and feel what she feels as she develops, without actually placing much emphasis on her herself, and instead teaching us about the world she inhabits. This more artsy style is an interesting deviation from other stories that tackle similar subject matter, but tend to be blunter in presentation. Good dystopic stories tend to create a dissonance between the world that's presented and what the audience is used to or comfortable with, and both of these anime do that as well through their world building, to obvious differing extents. Psycho-Pass is a dystopia that presents a technological setting that we as an audience can relate to and envision as a possible future, and even if the watcher doesn't buy into something like Sybil being a genuine possibility for the future, the setting itself independent from Sybil is one that seems to foreshadow what our world will become. Shinsekai Yori, on the other hand, is more unique and distinguishes itself from the classic dystopian settings. It's a world that is as abstract as its style, and one that isn't intending to hook the audience through realism or relatability right from the off. But the detailed world building ensures that it's one that is just as engaging as Psycho-Pass's. It's a world that is intent on saying that these themes and ideas on the human condition and order are ones that pervade dystopias, no matter what style of dystopia it is. And the idea that this darker side of mankind persists in any context is a very key one, because we can slowly see that this world is not so fundamentally different from our own. Both stories use this idea of dark humanity and integrate it with their focus on grey morality, and this grey morality is used effectively in the execution of the main antagonists of each work, Makishima and Squealer. It's a clever idea to use sympathetic and understandable villains in dystopia, since the point is to display the darkness within the human condition and the resulting complexity of civil order. Villains that question the established order with justified points are instantly more likely to establish a connection with the audience due to the audience probably forming questions of that same order on their own. And by the end of the shows, the point of these villains is to reinforce the audience's questioning of that world, and perhaps give them enough fuel through their actions to settle on a viewpoint. Both characters are focused on what they believe that true existence should be about: freedom. While Squealer talks on behalf of his queer rat brethren and is talking about a more literal freedom from enslavement, while Makishima is talking about a more spiritual and personal freedom, which is an issue that is also relevant in Shinsekai Yori, the concept is very much the same between the two. In both cases, the true beauty of the human spirit is stifled to keep things running smoothly, and this doesn't sit well with the two. It's a shameful and unfit existence for the both of them, and one that they refuse to accept. While I do think that it would be going a little bit too far to say that they were close to the heroes of the setting, you can't say that their intentions were not admirable, even if they went about it in terrible ways. And it could be argued that due to their insignificance in the grand scheme of things, mass violence was the only way for their points to be seen. So while both characters are very firmly antagonists, I wouldn't begrudge anyone who didn't feel right calling them villains. Squealer and Makishima both bring up the corruption of the current system, yet firmly oppose the protagonist whose motivations you're likely to root for. But in the end, both demonstrate how flawed the system is. They cause mass destruction and they exploit it, proving their ideological point by poking holes in the logical reasons the systems were created for in the first place. Both only committed terrible actions as a result of the system put in place, and thus, both are the optimal evidence for the system they despise being corrupt and flawed. Unfortunately for them, despite their great personal power, they did not succeed in their quest, and actually proved each narrative's point that all systems, especially radical ones, are flawed in some way. And we see that just because a revolt objects corruption, it does not mean that that objection is not corrupt itself. As one would expect, the governmental control in both settings means that the populace of both stories experience something similar. The good of the collective is emphasized, and in order to enforce the law, life is dictated by rules rather than personal desire. The desperate self-preservation is obvious, and the people labeled as criminals or outlaws are the ones that distinguish themselves the most from the passive crowd who just go about their roles. There's mass ignorance in both stories of the true nature of their worlds and the power structure, but it remains that way because searching for the truth in these settings labels you as a deviant or punishes you. There is a sort of unspoken, maybe even subconscious feeling among the people that something about this world is wrong. But it's hidden deep in the consciousness of the non-offensive civilians because they've been almost evolutionarily conditioned to not question things. People are forced to live a certain way to avoid being caught by the system as troublesome individuals. As such, society thrives, but individualism is stifled, and what could be considered true liberty is limited or non-existent. And this element of both shows is powerful, but it all feels a bit flimsy if the story is unable to convince the audience that these systems are needed for justifiable reasons. The entire premise of a dystopia can fall flat if the story is not good at convincing the audience that the dystopic system had to be established in the first place. Telling the audience of terrible events in the past that came to be is useful in this regard, but having the system fail and those consequences have an impact on the characters that we've gotten to know is far better. In both stories, the system fails, and the exact thing that those in power were trying to prevent is demonstrated. In Psycho-Pass, there is unpunished mass bloodshed on the streets, and in Shinsekai Yori, a fiend is developed and lays waste to the land. An effective dystopian story focuses on following through with the implications and reasons that the system was established, placing those consequences in the story's core and revolving the narrative around them. Both of these anime have a dominant, micromanaging force of order that looms over everything, and that is irritating to an extent, but the consequences that stimulated this order must prove to be worth the hassle. By demonstrating the evidence behind being so fiercely focused in the first place, it makes the whole system a lot more believable and substantial, even if it had fatal flaws. Now, obviously these systems are not perfect, because if they were, then the shows would go against everything that dystopias stand for. And arguably the biggest failure of both is on a moral level. The Sybil system is morally suspect at best, and simple anxiety or mild paranoia can lead into a downward spiral until that person is taken in as a latent criminal. It's pure thought crime. Mental instability, as it's labeled in this world, could be caused by any number of normal things. Being incredibly nervous or anxious, simple fear, or even grieving can lead to someone being taken in without even committing a crime. Stress should be a regular part of life, and it's actually healthy in smaller doses, but it's completely cut out here. Heightened emotions of any kind are discouraged, and this leads to a sterilization of society, a dismissal of a huge part of what makes us human. The system in Shinsekai Yori is just as morally suspect, though it is on a much more literal level than the attack on principles that's shown in Psycho-Pass. There is an invisible grip on the children in the series, shaping how they live their lives without them even realizing it. But this lack of freedom is not as serious as the biggest moral problem with the Ethics Committee and the Board of Education. In Shinsekai Yori, children who fit the personality type of a possible karma demon or fiend are driven away, exiled, and killed to maintain order. It's sheer slaughter to minimize risk. And an extension of this system is the horrific treatment that the queer rats endure in the present and throughout the past, though we'll get into the specifics about that in a little bit. But while both systems fail to varying degrees when it comes to simple respect of individual freedom and human nature, they also fail from a practical standpoint as discussed previously, because both had a fatal flaw and fell victim to the very thing those systems were created for. Psycho-Pass and Shinsekai Yori have a common line in that in deciding exactly how society should be run, those in power dedicate virtually all resources to minimizing any chance of risky people. In doing this, large-scale conflict can be avoided, but they were overconfident and complacent, and failed to realize that this minimization of the chances of large-scale conflict did not eliminate the chances of large-scale conflict, and this resulted in two societies incapable of dealing with an organized revolt. Through agonizing over small details to keep the risk of potential outliers low, both societies missed the forest for the trees. The cases where pacifism works, both in fiction and more importantly throughout our history, are few and far between. Humans are ingrained in violence, biologically and evolutionarily. We are destined to cycles of conflict. As unfortunate as it is, substantial violence will rear itself again and again. Conflict is programmed within humans, and therefore it is incredibly difficult to maintain a completely pacifist society bereft of strife, without big problems manifesting due to mankind's hubris and individuality. Oftentimes, keeping that conflict contained only does harm in the long run for how much it will boil over when it inevitably escapes. Maybe there is no such thing as a truly harmonious society, and implementing a system that sterilizes an instinct as base as individual freedom of thought, ideology, action, and speech for fear of any conflict at all causes more harm than good. In both stories, the crux of the narrative revolves around an indirectly oppressive body of power that governs a certain way. But there is also a twist in both that exposes the true nature of the system that had, until then, been unknown to the audience. At the expense of poor Kagari, it's revealed towards the end of Psycho-Pass that Sybil is actually not just an entirely computerized system following pre-programmed rules. Instead, it is composed of over 200 criminally asymptomatic people who had given their minds to Sybil in order to become the ultimate body of power. These individuals place their consciousness inside every Psycho-Pass scanner and dominator, and decide, after scanning the mentality of the subject, whether or not they are suitable to be in society. It must be said that computerization is not discarded entirely, but its influence is less than was originally thought. The effectiveness of this twist is debatable. On one hand, it reinforces the idea that self-interested people always have a hand in law enforcement, and strengthens the focus on dark humanity. It also adds an element of aristocracy with regards to these individuals thinking themselves to be superior enough to stealthily govern, and gives a bit of extra depth to Makishima through his dismissal of it. But on the other hand, it weakens the concept of technology being a double-edged sword, and instead shifts that focus to emphasize how terrible humans are in a story that's already basically about terrible humans. It is a little bit of a left-field development, and I've known people who had trouble buying into it, seeing it as completely unbelievable that this could happen in a society that has otherwise seemed somewhat realistic. But if you can suspend your disbelief or buy into this plot development, the effect it has on the narrative is actually not as monumental as you'd think. It does shift some ideas thematically and alters the focus a little bit, but the fundamental concepts that were present throughout remain pretty unchanged. But while Psycho-Pass is not affected too much by its twist, Shinsekai Yori stakes quite a bit on its revelation. While foreshadowed in the earlier episodes, the finale confirms that queer rats had not evolved from mole rats as was originally thought, but were actually descendants from humans in the past that were unable to use Cantus. These humans had become a problem because those with Cantus were given death feedback, but those without were able to kill other humans with no repercussion. The power was in the hands of the Cantus users due to their psychokinesis, but it could easily shift once the non-Cantus users realized their advantage. So, they were experimented on and rat genes were inserted into their DNA until they no longer resembled humans. Due to this, they were unaffected by death feedback and could be killed by Cantus users if needed. This twist adds an extra layer to the story that changes quite a lot. While the queer rat's plight was sympathetic before, it was simplistic, and just seemed like hubris-driven slave labor by the humans. But given what this twist implies, it makes the humans in the story seem simultaneously more understandable in their hierarchical placement of queer rats, yet even more repulsive in their treatment of them. What's understandable, though still morally bankrupt, is wanting to keep queer rats on a level inferior to them. Because what happens as soon as humans begin seeing them as equals is the situation that they were trying to avoid in the first place. A situation where there are two races, and if a conflict arises, as conflicts tend to arise, the humans are left without a way to defend themselves against an army that can destroy them. So for survival for the humans, the queer rats had to be looked at as an inferior, inhuman species. But that doesn't mean that they can't be respected as an intelligent species, and it doesn't mean that they don't deserve compassion. What the humans did was indeed understandable, but that doesn't mean it wasn't despicable. Survival is a necessity, but the path to ensuring it can be terrible. The queer rats simply wanted to reclaim the humanity that was lost, and Squealer acted as their liberator. He did atrocious things on his journey to trying to achieve this, and some of their actions are comparable to the evil that the humans committed, but again, this was for survival of his species. The humans and queer rats are really not unlike each other in this regard. Both are to blame for their atrocious acts, not just the queer rats, and this is clearer than ever if you use a role reversal. An interesting case arises when you think about how Squealer would be perceived if all of the humans in Shinsekai Yori looked like queer rats, and if all of the queer rats looked like humans, with the story unchanged. Or if you imagine the queer rats winning the war, and Saki being the one on trial instead of Squealer. Naked, in pain, constantly being subjugated to incredible agony. people will do reprehensible things to ensure their own well-being, and it could be argued that there are no truly good people in the story of Shinsekai Yori.
獣でないとしたらお前は何なのです。私たちは人間だ!
The virtuous people are the ones that perish, shackled by their morals, while the cynical progress. So as you can no doubt tell by comparing the lengths at which I talked about each show's twist, Shinsekai Yori banked a lot of emphasis on its twist to add even more gray to the topsy-turvy morality and social commentary that the story operates in. And Psycho-Pass's twist, while substantial, doesn't quite change as much, and instead uses several bigger moments to communicate its ideas that remain consistent throughout. Shinsekai Yori uses its twist to completely alter the moral landscape of the story and subsequently add to its sociological elements, and Psycho-Pass, through pulling a bit of a red herring and altering the themes of its work, had a firm, but not quite as strong impact. Neither of these styles of theme communication is innately worse than the other, and the two twists did serve much different functions. But in case you were curious about my opinion, I think that Shinsekai Yori's twist was more powerful in adding focus and strength to the final messages of the work, while Psycho-Pass's muddled the waters a tad, instead leaning on plot details and strong character focus to pull off its themes. As mentioned earlier, not only do both stories conquer similar ideas, but each finds its own way to reach a thematic conclusion that reflects the other. In Psycho-Pass, after Akane is shown the true nature of the Sibyl system and is faced with the choice to either allow things to stay the way they are or to change them, she makes the decision to keep things the way they are. Despite the disdain she has for the system and everything it stands for, she does see its merits, and is able to see what good it does for society. And though it's incredibly flawed, she can think of no viable alternative given the current circumstance, much less one that could be implemented properly. So in a twist of pragmatic irony, Akane reluctantly decides to maintain Sibyl and accept its control of society. The last few minutes of Shinsekai Yori are much different from Psycho-Pass in terms of tone. We see the now married Saki and Satoru talking about whether they think the world can change, and hoping that their child will grow up in a new and better world. This ending is feel-good and pretty hopeful, and actually kind of out of place given that there is no indication that things have changed. But this optimism proves to be very deceiving, and it all has to do with the little kittens that Satoru is playing with. In the years to come, these will mature into tainted cats that can be used to hunt down and kill humans. It's explained in the original novel that tainted cats are more needed now than ever before, because the anxiety that society has been afflicted with after the disaster that occurred thanks to Squealer increases the chance of fiends and karma demons. And with this little implication, we see that nothing has changed. Children will continue to be controlled and disposed of, queer rats will continue to be abused, and the world will remain stagnant. Also in the novel is a line from Saki that sums up her thoughts on the state of the world. I didn't want to believe it, but I felt that if the new order wasn't sealed with a massive amount of bloodshed, it might never take hold. This quote is interesting because Saki is fully self-aware in acknowledging that a new order was necessary. She knows that because nothing had really changed, her society, while healthy, was immoral and brittle. And another Squealer situation was perfectly capable of happening. Yet, everything was in a stalemate. It would take a lot of momentum to permanently change societal order, and that momentum would lead to a large-scale conflict, because the world can't be changed without issue. It's a delicate situation, and in this quote, Saki acknowledges this. But what is unclear is whether or not she was planning on unleashing this massive bloodshed to change the world for the better, or if she didn't think that it was worth it. Given how the anime ends, I'm inclined to believe that nothing changed, and that Saki simply decided to maintain the status quo. But it's very important to acknowledge the possibility of the alternative, because it really demonstrates the complexity of the situation. In both Psycho-Pass and Shinsekai Yori, the main character, while absolutely hating the system of order that their society is run by, ultimately decided against changing things. Akane and Saki, through their experiences and development, saw that despite the clear moral and structural shortcomings, it was necessary to maintain their respective systems. Both privately resolved to cement a place for themselves inside the hierarchy of control, and both had ambitions to gradually change it from within, though the probability of that slow internal change seems unlikely given the nature of both stories. As Saki reflected, only a full-scale upheaval would change things, and weighing out the costs and benefits of that is a tricky thing. And so, in these two situations, this societal self-preservation is necessary. There is no perfect solution for everyone, and this solution itself may leave a bitter taste in the mouth, but regardless, it may be best in the present. While understandable, we're given the perspective of how horrifying this pragmatism is, because we've just seen in the 20-something episodes prior how awful things can be when the holes in these systems are exploited and what the mental state of the populace is like. Both Akane and Saki had a chance to change the way society was run, and both ended up settling on a solution that was far from perfect, but functional. And given the darkness that both were exposed to throughout their journeys, it's understandable that they've come to think this way.
そうね、犬死にはごめんだし、今の世の中がシビラ抜きでは成り立たないのも事実だし。
Downplaying the inherent darkness of mankind is actually downplaying how difficult it is to be virtuous in a world that benefits those who are the opposite. It is not easy to be a good person, and it shouldn't be. Humans do not become good people because of the absence of darkness within them. It's because they overcome and cast aside that darkness. It is one of the most difficult things in the world to truly be a good person when your back is against the wall. As such, there is no perfect system for societal order. It just won't ever happen. One man's utopia is another man's hell. We are just too self-interested and too different from one another. Idealism is a wonderful thing, but when formulating opinions on order and hierarchy, sometimes an unsavory pragmatism is regrettably optimal. Perfection is unattainable, yet we must strive to reach it if we want to progress. And we must know that it is unattainable. That is absolutely key. It's a never-ending paradox of strife that'll likely never be solved, but great value can be gained from giving it our best shot. Through an integration of characterization, tone, setting, and theming, Psychopaths and Shinsekai Yori are stories that, above all, say that there is no perfect system, and as such, that extremism in any direction is undesirable. They advocate the value of looking at issues from alternate and even opposite perspectives, because only then can you properly examine your ideals and try to correct the flaws within them. It's partly a warning, and partly a promotion of perspective. That maybe the current world is terrible, but it's not like it's impossible to find something meaningful within it. That maybe boundaries in our reality exist, but they are not unbreakable if we have perspective and see reality for what it is. And there is undeniable value in that message. Many thanks for watching such a long video. I really appreciate it, and I'm slowly getting back into the swing of making videos after taking a bit of a break to rethink things. Please feel free to comment on anything I've said here, and give your thoughts on the two shows. In particular, I'd love to hear which one you liked better and why. Anyways, that's all I've got for now, but stay tuned for more soon.